The courtroom fell silent as Mr. Donovan, my grandfather's attorney, adjusted his glasses and began reading the will. I could feel my father's eyes boring into me from across the room, his jaw clenched tight. The mahogany paneling seemed to close in around us as the words hung in the air. And to my beloved granddaughter, Olivia Morgan, I bequeath Willow Creek Manor, the Morgan family estate, along with all its contents and surrounding property. I heard my father's sharp intake of breath before the explosion. This is ridiculous. My father, James Morgan, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. There must be some mistake. That property has been managed by me for decades. Mr. Donovan peered over his glasses, unruffled by the outburst. The will is quite specific, Mr. Morgan. Your father was absolutely clear in his intentions. I sat there, stunned. Grandfather had never hinted at this. The family estate was worth millions, not just in monetary value, but in its historical significance to River Heights. My hands trembled slightly as I remembered my last conversation with him. It had been 3 weeks ago. The hospital room had smelled of antiseptic, and the faint scent of the lavender sachets I'd brought to make it feel less sterile. Grandfather's once robust frame had been diminished, but his eyes had lost none of their intensity as he'd grasped my hand. "Olivia," he'd whispered, his voice raspy but determined. "Promise me you'll protect it, the house, the legacy, all of it." I'd nodded, not fully understanding the weight of what he was asking. "Of course, grandfather." "There are things you don't know," he'd continued. "Things about your father." Before he could finish, a coughing fit had overtaken him, and the nurse had ushered me out. He'd passed away 2 days later. Now, sitting in this courtroom, pieces were falling into place. 6 months earlier, I'd overheard a heated argument between my grandfather and father. I'd been home from grad school for the weekend and had stumbled upon them in grandfather's study. "I know what you've been doing with the development company, James," my grandfather had thundered. "Using my businesses to launder money. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" My father's voice had been cold, calculating. "You're an old man with outdated ideas about business. Those deals saved your outdated empire." "Those deals could land us all in prison," grandfather had replied. "I won't allow it." I'd backed away then, confused and troubled, but unwilling to believe the worst about my father. Now, I couldn't avoid the truth any longer. As we exited the courtroom, my father cornered me in the hallway, his expensive cologne suffocating in the confined space. "The estate needs to be sold immediately," he insisted, his voice lowered but intense. "The market is perfect right now, and I have buyers ready to sign. It's the sensible thing to do." I stepped back, creating distance between us. "I just inherited it less than an hour ago. I'm not making any decisions today." His eyes narrowed. "You don't understand what's at stake here, Olivia. That old house is a money pit, the property taxes alone." "Is it the house that's the problem, or the people you've promised it to?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, then calculation. "What exactly did my father tell you?" "Enough," I bluffed, watching his reaction carefully. Mr. Donovan approached before my father could respond. "Ms. Morgan, there's another stipulation I should mention. The property cannot be sold without your explicit written consent. Your grandfather was quite adamant about that point." My father's face darkened, but he quickly composed himself, smoothing down his already perfect tie. "We'll discuss this at home, Olivia. This isn't the place." As he strode away, Mr. Donovan handed me a thick envelope. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this privately. And Ms. Morgan, be careful. Your grandfather had concerns that extended beyond just the will." I clutched the envelope, a strange mix of grief and determination washing over me. Whatever game my father was playing, my grandfather had just dealt me into it, and I intended to play to win. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Nora Chen, my own attorney, in her sleek downtown office. Rain pattered against the windows as I slid the documents across her desk. "These appeared in my email yesterday, requesting my signature to finalize the sale of Willow Creek Manor," I I explained. But I never agreed to sell. Nora studied the papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. She picked up a magnifying glass from her desk and examined my signature at the bottom of the page. "This is good work," she murmured, "but not perfect." She looked up at me, her expression serious. "The pressure points are inconsistent with a natural signature. Your authentic signatures are more fluid, especially on the O in Olivia. Someone's forged this." I wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through me. "My father." "Most likely." Nora leaned back in her chair. "Olivia, I need to warn you. Men like your father, wealthy, connected, accustomed to getting their way, they can become dangerous when they're backed into a corner." "What should I do?" "Document everything. Don't sign anything he gives you. And be careful who you trust." She hesitated. "Have you found anything in the house that might explain why he's so desperate to sell it?" I thought of the countless rooms I'd searched, the drawers and cabinets I'd examined. "Not yet, but I'm still looking." As I left Nora's office, my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Ellie. "Need to talk. Coffee at Riverside Park, 4 p.m. Ellie had always been closer to my father than I was. As my Uncle Daniel's daughter, she'd grown up in the shadow of the Morgan business empire, eventually taking a position in their marketing department. We'd drifted apart over the years, but I was surprised to hear from her now. The park was quiet on this rainy Tuesday afternoon. Ellie was already waiting under the pavilion, 2 steaming cups on the table before her. Her normally perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and she kept glancing around nervously. "Thanks for coming," she said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "What's this about, Ellie?" She pulled out her tablet, tapped a few times, and turned it toward me. "I found these emails on the server at work. I shouldn't have access to them, but I was looking for marketing files and stumbled across this folder." I scanned the emails, my stomach tightening. They were exchanges between my father and someone named Marcus Blackwell, discussing the accelerated timeline for the Morgan property transfer. "Timeline accelerated. Buyers expect clean transfer by end of month," one email read. "Ensure all obstacles are removed." "He's planning to sell the estate whether you agree or not," Ellie said quietly. "And there's more. I got an anonymous email yesterday. It said there's evidence in the house hidden somewhere, evidence of what Uncle James has been doing." "Why are you showing me this?" I asked cautiously. "You've always been loyal to my father." Ellie's eyes welled with tears. "Because last week I overheard him and my dad talking about what would happen if you became difficult. The solutions they discussed. They scared me, Olivia." That night, I returned to the estate with renewed purpose. The house was eerily quiet, the antique grandfather clock in the hall marking each second with solemn precision. I made my way to my grandfather's study, the one room my father had specifically told me not to disturb until he had time to organize important documents. The study was just as my grandfather had left it, leather-bound books lining the walls, his collection of vintage maps framed and displayed, the scent of pipe tobacco still lingering. I began methodically searching, not entirely sure what I was looking for. Hours passed. I was about to give up when I noticed something odd about the old desk calendar. It was turned to June of last year, not the current month. Beneath it was a small handwritten note in my grandfather's distinctive script. "Check the heart carved in the garden wall. Count 3 stones up, 2 across. The drawer that never opened, the key is behind the loose brick." My pulse quickened. I knew exactly what he meant. As children, Ellie and I had discovered a heart someone had carved into one of the garden walls decades ago. We'd made it our special meeting spot, leaving little treasures for each other in a niche between the stones. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried outside. The night air was cool against my skin as I made my way through the overgrown garden. The carved heart was barely visible now, weathered by time. I counted, 3 stones up, 2 across, and pressed. The stone moved slightly. Behind it was a small brass key, tarnished with age. The drawer that never opened could only refer to one thing, the locked bottom drawer of my grandfather's desk that had been jammed for as long as I could remember. Heart pounding, I returned to the study and knelt before the desk. The key fit perfectly, turning with a satisfying click. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a USB drive labeled Evidence. As I reached for them, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around to find a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway. Interesting time for a trip down memory lane, isn't it? My father's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something dangerous. Before I could react, he flipped on the light switch, momentarily blinding me. In that instant, I shoved the USB drive into my pocket, leaving the journal visible in the drawer. I couldn't sleep, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. And since this is my house now, I thought I'd look through some of Grandfather's things. He stepped into the room, his eyes darting to the open drawer. Found anything interesting? Just some old journal, I said with a shrug, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Probably just household accounts. He held out his hand. Let me see it. I hesitated, then handed it over, praying he wouldn't notice the missing USB drive. He flipped through a few pages, his expression unreadable. Just as I thought, nothing important. He snapped the journal shut and tucked it under his arm. You should get some sleep, Olivia. We have a meeting with the real estate agent tomorrow. I haven't agreed to sell. His smile didn't reach his eyes. You will. It's what's best for everyone. After he left, I sat in the darkness for a long time, the weight of the USB drive in my pocket a reminder of what was at stake. Whatever my father was involved in, my grandfather had gathered evidence against him. Now it was up to me to use it. The warehouse district was practically deserted at 11 p.m. Ellie, Nora, and I huddled in Nora's car across the street from the address we'd discovered on the USB drive, a supposedly abandoned storage facility that appeared in numerous transactions documented in my grandfather's files. Are you sure about this? Nora whispered. We could just take this to the police. With what? I countered. Some emails and financial records that would take forensic accountants weeks to unravel. My father would bury it all before they even started looking. Ellie pointed to a black SUV pulling up to the building. That's him. And look, that's Marcus Blackwell with him. We watched as my father and a well-dressed man entered the warehouse. Through binoculars, I could see more figures inside, including my Uncle Daniel and several men I didn't recognize. We need to get closer, I decided. That's trespassing, Nora warned. Then stay here, I replied, already opening the car door. After a moment's hesitation, both Ellie and Nora followed. We crept along the side of the building until we found a partially open window. Voices drifted out clearly in the still night air. I can fix this, my father was saying, his voice tense. The house sale will cover everything once it's done. You said that 3 months ago, a heavily accented voice responded, Blackwell, I assumed. Mr. Vega is not a patient man, James. He wants his investment back with the promised returns. My daughter is being difficult about the sale, my father admitted. But I have a solution. By this time Friday, I'll have her signature on the papers, one way or another. My blood ran cold. Friday was just 2 days away. And what about the old man's records? Another voice asked. Destroyed, my father assured them. There's nothing to worry about. I glanced at Ellie, whose face had gone pale. We'd heard enough. Carefully, we retreated to the car. He's planning to forge my signature within the next 48 hours, I said once we were safely driving away. We need to move faster than I thought. The next morning, Nora called with alarming news. He's moving even faster than we expected, she reported. I've checked with contacts at the county recorder's office. The sale documents for Willow Creek Manor are already being processed. How is that possible? I never signed anything. Someone with your ID submitted the paperwork early this morning. The sale is registered to a company called Vega Enterprises. My mind raced. Can you stop it? I've filed an injunction claiming fraud, but it will take time. Meanwhile, you need to secure the property and any evidence. If your father realizes we're onto him. I'm going there now, I decided. When I arrived at the estate, my father's car was already in the driveway. I found him in my grandfather's study, rifling through the desk drawers. "Looking for something?" I asked from the doorway. He straightened, momentarily startled, then composed himself. "Just gathering some important family documents before the transfer." "You mean before you illegally sell my property, using forged documents?" His expression hardened. "You stupid girl, do you have any idea what you've done? The people you're dealing with?" "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I retorted. "A money launderer who's in over his head with some very dangerous people." "You know nothing," he spat. "I built this family's fortune while my father wasted time on his precious historical preservation projects. When the recession hit, someone had to make the hard choices. By laundering money for criminals." He moved toward me menacingly. "Where is it? The USB drive?" "Somewhere safe," I replied, standing my ground despite my racing heart. "Along with copies of all the evidence showing how you've been using the family businesses to clean dirty money." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made us both turn. My Uncle Daniel appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "James, we need to talk," he said, glancing between us. "Alone." "We're in the middle of something here," my father snapped. "It's important," Uncle Daniel insisted, his usual deference to my father notably absent. "Marcus called. There's a problem with the transfer." My father's face darkened. "Stay here," he ordered me, following my uncle out. The moment they left, I went straight to the bookshelf behind the desk. There was one place I hadn't checked yet, a section my grandfather had always treated with special care. I ran my fingers along the spines of the leather-bound classics until I felt a slight difference in one. Pulling it revealed not a book, but a hollow container designed to look like one. Inside was another journal, newer than the one my father had taken. I flipped it open to find detailed notes in my grandfather's handwriting, dates, transactions, names, and observations spanning the last 5 years. "Grandfather knew," I whispered to myself. "He knew everything, and he left us the proof to stop them." The Riverside Convention Center gleamed under the afternoon sun, its modern glass facade a stark contrast to the historical architecture surrounding it. Inside, the city's elite mingled in the grand ballroom, champagne flutes in hand, waiting for the announcement of the new development project that promised to revitalize the city's historic district. I stood at the back of the room, watching my father work the crowd. Beside him was Ethan Reynolds, the developer whose company was front and center in my grandfather's records of suspicious transactions. Nora and Ellie flanked me, our presence still unnoticed in the bustling crowd. "Are you ready for this?" Nora asked quietly. I nodded, clutching the portfolio containing everything we'd compiled over the past 2 days. Financial records, emails, my grandfather's journals, and the injunction from the court temporarily halting the property transfer. My father stepped up to the podium, his smile confident as he tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for what I believe is a landmark moment for our community." His voice carried across the hushed room. "Change is inevitable, but it's how we shape that change that defines us. Today, I'm proud to announce the sale of the historic Morgan estate to Reynolds Development for their visionary Willow Creek Heritage Project." Polite applause filled the room as Ethan Reynolds joined my father at the podium. "Mr. Reynolds and his team understand the importance of preserving our city's character while embracing progress," my father continued. "The property has been in my family for generations, and I wouldn't entrust it to anyone who didn't share our values." That was my cue. I moved forward, Nora and Ellie beside me. "Speaking of values," I called out, my voice cutting through the applause, "I'd like to say a few words about those." The crowd parted as I approached the stage. My father's smile faltered momentarily before he recovered. "My daughter, everyone," he announced with forced joviality. "Olivia has been instrumental in uncovering exactly what's been happening with the family businesses over the past 5 years," I interrupted, taking the stage. "While change is certainly inevitable, as my father says, neither is fraud, or money laundering for that matter." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reynolds took a subtle step away from my father. I'm afraid my daughter has been under a great deal of stress recently, my father said smoothly. The loss of her grandfather led to me inheriting the Morgan estate, I finished for him. The same estate that my father is attempting to sell today without my consent, using forged documents. I opened the portfolio and removed the court injunction, handing copies to several reporters in the front row. This is a temporary injunction preventing the sale of Willow Creek Manor due to fraud, I explained. And these, I nodded to Ellie, who connected her tablet to the presentation system. These are the records of how Reynolds Development has been used to launder money through various construction projects over the past 5 years. The screens around the room filled with transaction records, emails, and flowcharts showing the movement of funds through shell companies. The encrypted emails are all here, Ellie announced. Every transaction, every shell company, every penny laundered through the construction projects. Reynolds paled visibly, already backing away. I had no knowledge of any impropriety, he stammered. If there have been questionable transactions, they were handled entirely by Morgan Investments. My father lunged for the microphone. This is preposterous. These documents are fabricated. The FBI doesn't think so, Nora interjected, her phone to her ear. Yes, Detective Sawyer, we're all still here at the Riverside Convention Center. You're 5 minutes out. Perfect. The room erupted in chaos. Reynolds and several others made hasty exits while reporters surged forward, cameras flashing. My father grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully into my flesh. You have no idea what you've done, he hissed. This isn't over. I met his gaze steadily. For you, it's just beginning. The courtroom was even more crowded for my father's trial than it had been for my grandfather's will reading. I sat in the front row beside Ellie and Nora as my father took the stand, impeccably dressed despite 3 months in custody awaiting trial. My daughter is young, naive, he told the jury, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. She doesn't understand the complexities of business, of family legacy. She discovered some accounting irregularities and jumped to conclusions. His attorney nodded encouragingly. And why would she do that, Mr. Morgan? My father looked directly at me. Revenge, perhaps. Our relationship has been strained since her mother left, or maybe she truly believes these accusations. Either way, I maintain my innocence. No further questions, Your Honor. As the prosecution rose for cross-examination, my father's attorney leaned in to whisper something that made him smile coldly. I knew what was coming next. Ms. Morgan, the prosecutor began, your father has suggested you might have personal reasons for these accusations. Would you care to address that? I approached the witness stand, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom. My father thinks he can discredit me by bringing up painful family history, I said calmly. He's already threatened to expose certain indiscretions that would be devastating if made public. My father's smug expression confirmed my words. But what he doesn't realize is that I am his daughter, which means I learned from the best about keeping receipts. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence, my grandfather's personal journal, which contains detailed observations of every suspicious transaction, every late-night meeting, every shell company created over the past 5 years. The journal was entered into evidence, and excerpts were displayed on the courtroom screens. My grandfather's meticulous notes tracked my father's descent into criminal activity with painful clarity. My grandfather suspected what was happening, but needed proof, I explained. He spent the last years of his life documenting everything while trying to figure out how to stop it without destroying our family name. My father's face had gone ashen. As the prosecutor continued questioning me about specific transactions, my Uncle Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Finally, he stood. I need to say something, he announced. My father lunged toward him. You told them you spineless. Court officers restrained him as Uncle Daniel approached the stand. I helped James create those documents, he admitted, his voice breaking. I watched him build this whole scheme and I did nothing to stop it. At first, it was just about making more money. Then it became about covering our tracks. Ellie stepped forward next, adding her testimony about the records she'd discovered. One by one, former employees and associates came forward, the dam of silence finally breaking. When the verdict came 3 weeks later, my father was found guilty on all charges: money laundering, fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. As federal agents led him away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with me one last time. There was no remorse there, only cold fury and the promise of retribution that would never come. The early morning light streamed through the restored stained glass windows, casting prismatic patterns across the polished hardwood floors. 3 months had passed since the verdict, and Willow Creek Manor was slowly returning to its former glory. "The East Wing is almost finished," Andrea, the restoration supervisor, reported as we walked through the hallways. "The gallery is ready for the historical photographs whenever you are." I nodded, picturing the space filled with the family photos Ellie had discovered in the attic, images that told the true story of the Morgan legacy, not the corrupted version my father had tried to create. Nora met us in the main hall, legal papers in hand. "Everything's official," she announced with a smile. "The title's clear and the Preservation Trust is ironclad. No one can ever sell this property or develop it commercially." Just as my grandfather had wanted. Ellie arrived moments later, carrying a box of additional photographs she'd found. "Look at these," she said excitedly. "From the 1920s when the house was first built." As we sorted through them, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The house seemed different now, lighter, as if it could breathe again after years of carrying the weight of secrets. Outside, volunteers from the Historical Society were planting wildflowers and my grandfather's beloved rose bushes. The community outreach program we'd established was already funding educational grants for local students interested in historic preservation and sustainable development. "What do you think your grandfather would say if he could see this?" Nora asked as we stood on the terrace overlooking the grounds. I smiled, remembering his final words to me. "I think he'd say that we protected the legacy, the real one, not the one my father tried to build." The path forward wasn't entirely clear yet. There were still financial matters to untangle, relationships to rebuild, and my own career to consider. But standing there, watching new life being planted in soil once poisoned by greed and deception, I felt certain of one thing: no more shadows, no more secrets, just light, possibility, and the steady foundation of truth that my grandfather had helped me build. The price of truth had been high: my father's imprisonment, the exposure of family crimes, the painful unraveling of lifelong relationships. But as I looked out over the estate that now truly belonged to me, I knew it had been worth it. This wasn't just about reclaiming a property. It was about reclaiming a legacy and transforming it into something honest and good. In the end, that was the greatest revenge of all.